So most horror films usually have some sort of standout title which immediately conveys to the audience the nature of the film. Horror films such as Scream, Zombieland, and to some extent The Shining are really good examples of this. These titles all follow a theme of short and powerful names, so following this theme I'm calling my film Slender Man. Slender Man is a short, simple, and memorable title about the eponymous figure that haunts the characters in the film. Using the character of Slender Man as the title focuses it on this mysterious creature which people want to know about. The Cabin in the Woods is another horror film which uses something eponymous, in this case a structure, as the title. The font is very slim in appearance to really express and emphasise the slender aspect of Slender Man. The title grows out of the shadows, mimicking the appearance of Slender Man, who can appear out of nowhere. All titles in my opening sequence follow the same slim white theme, however these titles, compared to the main movie title, flicker and twitch a little bit before simply disappearing. Abnormal titles like this are quite typical of horror. The titles in Seven are a good example. So the location I'm using is a dark and sinister forest, which is actually quite conventional of horror films. This type of setting is quite a prominent feature in the Blair Witch Project, for example. These settings are really effective because anything could be lurking within their darkness and could strike at any moment, causing psychological horror. The simple thought of being isolated in such a remote and dark and perhaps evil place may be enough to make the audience uneasy. So the focus of my opening sequence is around one single character, Andy. Many people will mistake him for being the main character, but actually Roy is the main character since Andy dies straight away in the film, or at least that's what's being implied. The character of Andy is not conventional of horror films since he's actually a teenage male instead of being female. Typically you'd have a young blonde woman as the victim, so the reason I've made the decision is really to try and challenge the conventions of horror and appeal to my male target audience much more. Slender Man, however, is quite a typical antagonist. So props in horror films are both conventional and vital for the genre in order to create a sense of fear. This is typically done by a character simply having dangerous and lethal equipment, such as knives and axes the character Patrick Bateman uses in American Psycho. So there are three main props I used in my opening sequence: the camera, the torch, and the notes. The camera was carried by Andy to try and take pictures of Slender Man, but unfortunately he wasn't able to. I used three notes in my opening sequence, each of them having sinister and enigmatic messages written on them and on located on the trees. The notes suggest that something is here and something has already happened to someone, foreshadowing a similar fate is going to happen to Andy. However, the third and most important prop in the opening sequence is the torch. The torch brings so much impact to the opening sequence. It is the only light source Andy has in the darkness, and is what gives both him and the audience the visibility needed. My favourite scene in the entirety of the opening sequence is when Slender Man appears immediately after Andy picks up his torch. This would not have been possible without the setting and lighting provided by the torch. These scenes that try to make the audience jump are also really quite conventional of horror films. So the appearance of a character is very important in horror films, such as the character of Freddy from A Nightmare on Elm Street, who looks absolutely menacing thanks to his costume and makeup. So Slender Man's costume consists of a full white suit and a white morph mask, which I purchased from morphsuits.com. Slender Man's appearance is vital, as is any creature or antagonist in horror. A strange figure with no face, or at least wearing a mask, hunting down victims is a scary and conventional sight seen in horror films. It is the anonymity that causes fear and raises enigma codes. So props in horror films are both conventional and essential for the genre in order to create a sense of fear. This is typically done by having a character use dangerous and lethal equipment, such as knives and axes the character Patrick Bateman uses in American Psycho. So there are three main props I use throughout my opening sequence: the camera, the torch, and the notes. The camera was carried by Andy to try and take a picture of Slender Man, but unfortunately he wasn't able to. I used three notes in my opening sequence, each of them having sinister and enigmatic messages written on them. These notes suggest that something is here and something has already happened to someone, foreshadowing a similar fate will happen to Andy. However, the third and most important prop in the opening sequence is the torch. The torch just brings so much impact to the opening sequence. It is the only light source Andy has in the darkness, and what gives both him and the audience visibility. My favourite scene in the entirety of the opening sequence is when Slender Man appears and Andy picks up his torch. These scenes that try to make the audience jump are extremely conventional of horror films, and this would not have been possible without the setting and lighting provided by the torch. There are three main ways to open a film: to introduce the characters, to introduce the setting, or to introduce the story. Much like the opening for Scream, my opening is focused around the killer or creature in this instance. Both my character Andy and the character of Casey die at the beginning, centering the opening on the antagonist. Now, very little of the story is actually given away. The only thing the audience learn is that this student is going into the woods to find Slender Man. The main purpose of the opening is to introduce Slender Man and show what he is capable of. The voiceover provided helps to give the audience insights to the argument that's taken place between Andy and Roy prior to this event, giving him the motivation to search for Slender Man in these dark woods. So the horror genre is established immediately through the use of the dark setting, ominous soundtrack, and the mysterious voiceover. I use music to create suspense and emphasize the scenes that are supposed to be surprising. This technique has been conventional in horror for quite some time. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho is an excellent example of suspense. The only special effects are really used in the opening sequence is the sudden flash where Slender Man appears. Trying to startle the audience through sudden flashes is quite conventional with horror films, as seen in Paranormal Activity.